All right. So clearly, everyone, at least me, personally speaking, is worried and following inflation numbers every single, at least every single month, maybe daily to a certain extent, but certainly every single month. And funny enough, just finished up a webinar, that was sort of like a quarterly webinar market report that we put out there. And so what was interesting, Andrew, is that literally, what really blows my mind is the fact that 3 years ago, in 2019, the world was more concerned about deflation. The world was more concerned about literally not meeting their targets. And so now, obviously, a very, very big pandemic in between, it's the exact opposite. So if you don't mind, explain kind of how we got here, and then what are your current thoughts of the inflationary environment?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you mentioned, coming out of the last recession, let's go back to the financial crisis. For the 10 years following that, the Fed was targeting, they looked to try to keep inflation at just around 2%. And for that 10-year period, roughly, after the financial crisis, it felt like they could never get there. We were at 1%, 1.5%, and they kept talking about, inflation's falling a little bit short. It felt like we couldn't get enough inflation. And I think, honestly, that was one of the things that kind of caught the Fed flat-footed when we went through COVID, is that they just went through 10 years trying to get inflation higher, and it wouldn't go. So they expected that, yes, forces would hit, yes, things would impact, but inflation was hard to find. So I think they thought that it was going to come down a lot faster. Now, what happened was we get into COVID, and immediately we have two key things happening. One is production comes offline. Right? You remember we had the shutdowns, the shelter in place. We saw businesses shut their doors. We saw supply chains. And supply chains are this incredibly intricate, knitted network. There's almost nothing you can create today that doesn't involve 10, 15, 20 other companies, right? Whether it's the inputs to go into your tools or the clothes that you're wearing to go to work, the coffee that you brew to get up and go in the morning. And all of a sudden, these connections, there was a little sand in the gears when things shut down. So we have the supply side of the economy get pulled down. At the same time, the Fed is dealing with a health crisis. Right? These businesses were shutting their doors not because they had bad products, not because they had bad service, right? We were shutting down due to COVID. And so the Fed stepped in and said, look, we need to find a way. Congress stepped in and said, we need to find a way to kind of balance this out. So what did we do? We put money into the system. So we increased the purchasing power of consumers. At the same time, we had less things available to purchase. And this created the classic inflation dynamic, more money chasing the same or fewer goods. Right? And it took a little bit of time because people were really cautious in the early days. They didn't know if their job was going to be there in 2 months, 3 months, 5 months. So at the very beginning, everybody kind of hunkered down. But when we turned that corner, and it really started to turn from an economic standpoint in about June of 2020, and we started getting back to work, the job gains started to pick up. We said, hey, look, I might not be able to go to that restaurant in person, but the restaurant said, well, okay, we'll set up tents outside, or we'll set up a front door delivery. We're going to find ways to continue interacting. We were purchasing. Consumers were buying at new highs by the end of 2020. It took less than a year for activity to come back. Now, we were still putting money into the system. We had additional stimulus bills. We had the Paycheck Protection Program. In total, we added $5.5 trillion into the system, and we did it in a way that's very different from what we've done in most other points in the past. You go back, let's say, to the financial crisis, and there was some spending, right? There was TARP. There was things like quantitative easing by the Fed. But what we did this time that was so different is we gave checks to people. And we gave checks to businesses with no need to pay them back as long as you started following certain rules. So we really amplified the money that consumers and businesses have to spend. In my background, I did undergrad in economics, I did grad school in economics, I did the CFA program with a focus in economics. You don't need to take a single economics course to understand that when you give people money, they'll spend it. So we had this big jump in money in the system, a limit in terms of the total number of things available for purchase, and that mismatch between supply and demand really started to drive inflation. And what we're dealing with today is that there's a substantial amount of money that remains in the system. We are today about 42% more money in the hands of consumers and businesses, and GDP just got back. So there's 42% more money, and we're buying, and we have the same number of things that we can purchase as we did when all this started. Until we get this kind of in check, and the money growth has stopped, that's a positive. But until we can either make this up via inflation or we can get more production, inflation is going to be arguably the biggest thing that we're dealing with. And I think that's going to remain through 2022. I think we're likely going to see it in 2023. I think it's probably going to take into 2024 to get these wheels balanced again. But once we do, I think we start going back towards the scenario that we had pre-COVID, that 1.5–2% inflation environment. It's that the economy right now needs to digest this huge bulk of money to enter the system.